and welcome back to Relentless Learning. I'm going to be going over this 70-something page report that was released by the Ontario Human Rights Committee, the OHRC, this year in regards to basically people are not happy with how reading's being taught in Ontario. Now, it's not just anecdotal. It's not just like, oh, we're not happy with it. It's based on some standardized testing, and apparently the students in Ontario are a certain large, arguably large percentage of them are not meeting the provincial standard. Now, the report is called The Right to Read, and the reason why it's called that, the premise is that reading is a right. Everyone should have access to it, and it's not a privilege. Now, that makes sense, right? Our schools, or public schools, our elementary, middle, high schools, they're public, they're free. But when we consider certain situations like students with special needs, where in certain circumstances they need people to help them support the learning, they need special resources like assistive technology to be able to help them. When school boards or schools, when for whatever reason that's not available, the argument is that does affect their learning, and in this case it affects their ability to develop their reading, right? So they mentioned this student from BC. It's called the Moore case. I think it was Jeffrey Moore, and essentially the student with special needs was denied their right to learn how to read, to learn how to read well, to become a strong reader as a result of the school board not providing the necessary resources needed for this child. So I'm gonna take a moment and just address the non-teachers, the non-parents, and people are like, why is this important? So you can think in terms of the social and economic impact as a result of people not being able to read, right? Because it's not just early readers, right? Think of someone who doesn't learn how to read well in the younger years, then progresses on, right? Do they finish school? Maybe, maybe not. Let's say they do graduate from school, but there's difficulty, let's say, I won't say strong challenges with being able to read proficiently. We can just kind of imagine how that might affect what type of jobs this person might do. And again, not to make it about like, oh, we need people doing X, Y, Z jobs, but we can understand that there's going to be a broader impact. At least that is the premise that this report is based on, right? And they're basically saying it is important. So what is the process? So the OHRC, the Ontario Human Rights Committee, worked with two experts, and I'm using little finger quotations because I didn't fact check. I presume that they're telling the truth. Two experts in reading disabilities, just reading in general, right? So in short, they worked with these two experts, I'm choking up on my words here, and they interviewed and they looked at statistics from I think like 13 school boards, from teacher training programs, and then they had a bunch of surveys sent out to families, students themselves, the general public, and they basically compiled all that data. Now, the key point about this study is that they were focusing on what was called word level reading. So basically what that means is being able to read the word. Sounds easy, right? But when we compare it to like comprehension or making inferences, they weren't looking at that. They were specifically looking at being able to read words. Now, that's really important for the younger readers, right? Kindergarten, grade 1, where they're really they're essentially learning phonics, right? The letter B makes a B sound, right? But it's also important to realize that this affects older students as well, older individuals, because when we struggle with that at a younger age, sometimes that kind of progresses on into later years of our life if it goes unchecked. Okay, so I pulled out a quote from page 5. And I'm gonna read it to you, which is why I'm looking down, just because I didn't want to misquote this, because I thought this was really, really important to this whole, I don't call it an argument, but this whole inquiry into reading in Ontario. And it says, again, from page 5, despite their importance, it's talking about, the reading words, foundational word reading skills have not been effectively targeted in Ontario's education system. Pausing for a second just to say, is this anecdotal? What's being considered to be effective? I'm also wondering, is it just based solely on the standardized testing that they mentioned earlier? Is it like less than 30, more than 30%? I don't know. Going back to the quote, it says, they have been largely overlooked in favor of an almost exclusive focus on contextual word reading strategies and on sociocultural perspectives on literacy. So in short, they're basically saying we need a stronger phonics program and we need to focus less on other cues, like, for example, look at the picture and guess what the word means. Now, going back to this quote, which is again why I'm looking down, I personally found it again, my little question mark was going off in my brain because it says exclusive focus, which for me is a bit of a subjective word. Is this based on what's written in the curriculum? Curriculum technically doesn't even talk about these strategies. It just talks about the end goal. Like, you students should be able to do this at the end of this grade. It's not telling strategies per se. Are they interviewing teachers? Did 9 out of 10 teachers say, yes, we're not teaching phonics, we're teaching this? So I don't know, I just found that statement to be a little bit strong. Not sure how I feel about that. I'm going to take a quick moment to break off into a tangent, just because for me, there was a huge learning point here. When they talk about dyslexia, like, I kind of had an idea of what it was, but they described it as having difficulties with reading fluently. So I guess like you read very choppy instead of reading with like a nice flow, a predictable flow. Issues with accuracy and decoding, which makes sense, right? So instead of like a B, it's read as a D. So instead of a ball, you have a doll. And then spelling. Now, by that definition, I was like internally being like, oh, like I was definitely a struggling reader. Now, granted, I was also learning a different language at the same time, but my first thinking based on that was, if that's the term of dyslexia, then that means a lot of people might actually fall under that category. Not saying it's good or bad or anything like that, but just something to bear in mind. So this report right off, touch the mic, sorry. This report right away has 2 recommendations. One, dyslexia needs to be discussed in schools and used as an official term. I can tell you anecdotally, based on what I've seen, that dyslexia is, and the report says this as well, it's not a term that's used, right? And now then it becomes, well, you need to have a professional, because teachers are not professionals to be able to diagnose as dyslexia. They don't have the training. So anyways, going off on a tangent here again. But the first recommendation right off the bat is they're saying dyslexia needs to be used in schools. And the second recommendation, which I was like, woo, this is awesome, because intuitively it makes sense to me, is we need to make a differentiation. We need to note the difference between a learning disability and a reading disability. Now, I really like that, because learning disabilities are like this wide umbrella term, but a reading disability or difficulty with reading is much more specific. And I feel like that's really important, because presumably, you know, resources are limited in schools and in school boards. And so sometimes there's prioritization of student challenges, like, and who gets to see the special needs teacher. And so I feel like it's very important when we say reading disability or challenges with reading, we're being very specific. And especially when you're looking at the earlier years, that is really important, right? And granted, even if you're looking at someone in middle school, like grade 7A, if they can't read or they have challenges with reading, that is something that needs to be addressed. Now, the key point that we need to focus on is that this report is saying that even though dyslexia is assumed to be neurological in its origins, right? So it's based as like some sort of developmental difference in someone's brain, with evidence-based intervention. So that means when we're actually targeting it and we're actually trying to help students with specific evidence-based strategies like phonics, that we can help circumvent it, we can help prevent it from becoming a full-on disability later in life. So basically, we can help mitigate some of these challenges if we catch on to it early enough. So the question then becomes, what do we need to do to be able to teach these word reading skills? So the first one obviously is, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but the curriculum, they're recommending that it needs to be research-based, right? Those are the practices that need to be put in there. Now, call me a little, but I was under the assumption that the curriculum was based on research-based, like evidence-based practices. Now, you could say that the curriculum, like if you look up Google Ontario language curriculum, as I mentioned earlier in the video, it's more based on outcomes. Students should be able to do this, right, by the end of the school year. It's not actually saying specifically students should be able to like decode the word ball, right? So maybe they're just meaning in the report to be a little bit more explicit. I'll link it at the bottom of this video, but I did come across it's technically a book, but Relentless Learning doesn't have the money to purchase the whole thing, but I was able to read off of the website like a very short sample, like chapter 2, chapter 3. Andrew Johnson, 2021, so it was released last year. He's a professor, a literacy professor from Minnesota. Definitely a state starting with the letter M. And basically, this person was saying that it's not necessarily completely phonics, that the way we're doing it is okay right now, and they go into citing quite a bit of research in it. So as like a non-researcher or non-reading expert, I'm kind of like, well, what do I believe? So I just wanted to point that out there. Number 2, the second recommendation that they have is we need to have early screening using standardized assessment. Now, intuitively, that makes sense. Like if there's a problem with reading, it makes sense that we would want to be able to detect it on the early years, right? But obviously we have to think in terms of implementation and what that looks like. If you look on the Ministry of Education, the website, PPM 155, so that stands for Program Policy Memorandum, I did it, PPM 155. Basically, that memorandum says that teachers are the professionals and they get to use their professional discretion, right? Their professional judgment to decide what goes on in the classroom. Now, it makes sense when you have like a super passionate teacher and like they tailor their program for sure. But then the downside, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because who gets to be passed on to like the special education team for diagnostics if someone's like falling behind or they're not meeting standard, levels. So that's the only kind of downside of that. And PPM 155 basically says we can't standardize it because at the end of the day, teachers are the ones in charge. So there's a bit of conflict of interest with being able to come up, I think, with a pre-screening test. The other thing to take into consideration is that at the end of the day, this is both anecdotal, but what's like I've experienced it, but I've also I read it in the report, and it says that most of the screening doesn't officially happen really until grade 3. Like there is some screening in senior kindergarten, like year 2 kindergarten, but according to the report, the majority, like the best intervention when it comes to reading recovery should be happening in kindergarten and grade 1, latest grade 2. So then there's, again, a conflict of interest. Do we do it in grade 3 when they're a little bit older, or are we doing it in the early years? And my mind was blown. It said on page 31, I'm looking at my notes. Yeah. Page 31, that idea of like some delays are normal. When someone's learning how to walk, some kids learn how to walk faster than others. Some kids learn how to read faster. Some kids learn how to speak faster. I was under the impression that's normal, but the idea of some delays in reading specifically, according to this report, it says it's a misconception. Now, I didn't fact check. I didn't go further. I'm kind of just taking their word for it. But basically, they're saying that because that's a misconception, when we're noticing that some students are not picking up like letter sound associations in the younger years, we need to check it out. So I was like, all right, I believe you. So to recap, number 1 was curriculum. We need to change it up. Number 2 was screening. Number 3 was we need to come up with more effective interventions, both of when we do it and how we do it. And then number 4, accommodations and modifications. So if you're not familiar with those, basically you're changing the environment, or you're providing the student with some sort of assistance. That's an accommodation to help them succeed. Modification is when you actually have to change the curriculum in a way. Either, let's say they have to do 3 things. Maybe that student only has to do 2 or only has to do 1. Or you're reducing the intensity of like how complex, the complexity is what you're reducing. So OHRC is recommending that teachers receive PD, like professional development, in terms of how to appropriately and effectively give accommodations and modifications, but they also need professional development in terms of like how to use assistive technology. And I don't know about you, but sometimes it is a little infuriating to like walk into a situation, not infuriating, but it's a little tiresome. And like you have to use something and then you have to Google how to use it and then you don't know how to use this. So it's basically a lot of rabbit hole on YouTube. So professional development to be a little bit more effective with time. I mean, that sounds like a good idea. The last recommendation that they made was professional assessment. So if we we use this screening, the standardized screening, point number 2, that should be able to kind of take most of students in terms of being able to improve their reading skills. However, there are going to be some circumstances where a professional, like a psychologist or like someone outside of the school, is going to have to come in to assess the students. All right, so there are 3 things that they mentioned that I was able to tease out rather. The first one is phonemic awareness. So that's essentially can the reader identify, manipulate individual sounds? So I'm gonna be writing that down just for our awareness. That is sound. So identifying the first and the last sound in a word. So for example, if I say ball, then the student should be able to tell you that the letter sound is b, right? Now, just be aware that this is an oral skill. We're not getting into writing yet. That's number 2. That's phonics. So that's letter sound association. So here you can think of this as spelling, right? So again, I wouldn't use the word ball because the A sound is not, let's say it's not prototypical. Let's use a word like bat, for example, either baseball bat or the animal bat. So if I was a student, I could say b. Okay, well, I know that's a B. Then like apple, that's an A, and then t. So again, just to reiterate, it's telling us that we should be using these explicit techniques. Now, number 3 looks at word structures and patterns. So that's essentially your prefixes, your suffixes, and your word roots. Now, when you continue to read, it's mentioning this is what we should be teaching in classrooms, but what tends to happen or kind of happens more often is what's called the 3 cueing system. Now, because this is what the whole report is saying we shouldn't be doing, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we have three letters to help you remember. M stands for meaning, S stands for syntax, and V is visual. So meaning, you can think of contextual clues to figure out what is going to happen. So it's like, what word do you think will happen? And then, the student might say, oh, the word that makes sense afterwards is to have the word next, right? So it's using contextual cues. I'm just gonna write context cues to help us out with that. Syntax, I think of it as grammar, right? So if I was talking about having read a book last week, read and read have the same pronunciation. So would I have read a book last week, or would I have read a book last week? So we're using our knowledge of grammar to be able to help us. And V is a little bit easier. It's visual cues, right? So looking at pictures, and just FYI, this is what the report is saying we should definitely not be getting students to rely on. And the key point is rely. Not saying that we shouldn't necessarily use it, but they're very strongly saying do not get students to use that as their main thing in terms of when they're reading. Now, balanced literacy, I'm not going to get into this one, but it's a gradual release of responsibility. So first you have the teacher, then that kind of shows how to read or what to do, what strategy. Then you're going to have the students work with the teacher, so teacher plus students. Then you might have students working in small groups, and then essentially you're moving towards independence. But again, according to this report, it's saying that is not a good idea until we've kind of mastered these 3: phonemic awareness, phonics, and word structures and pattern. So to summarize the whole thing, basically decoding is life. What I mean by that is it's an important skill to be able to read and sound out the words, and that needs to be explicitly taught at the younger grades as well as with struggling readers, according to this report. Now, it doesn't necessarily imply that everything else needs to be thrown out the window. However, on page 26, they do say that the 3 cueing system and what's called the balanced literacy approach, that it can be detrimental depending on how it's used, because students get too used to relying on like visual cues and contextual cues. So not my words, but theirs. I do want to mention that throughout the whole thing, I found that the report was very clear in saying we're not blaming the teachers. It's more of a Ministry of Education, then passed on to teacher training programs, then passed on to like school board. So again, they're not blaming teachers, but they're basically saying we need a revamp. And I'm very curious, what do all of you think? Do you think it's just kind of like my theory is better, or do you think that there's more truth behind this report? Because again, Ontario Human Rights Committee, it's not just anyone, right? It's government, it's big. Anyways, let me know what you think. And I know it was a long video, so thank you for sticking around. Bye!